The Cuban Missile Crisis cemented the idea of mutually assured destruction, restricted future exchanges, and set the precedent for the United States' prospective encounters with other nations. After World War II, the undeclared war between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated. Communists and capitalists were separated by the Berlin Wall. This set a boundary, strengthening the tension between the two countries. Another tension that played into this crisis was between the United States and Cuba. Fidel Castro came to power over Cuba in 1959 and expressed disapproval for America's interest and involvement in his country. Soon, a diplomatic relationship between Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and Castro occurred. In response, America stopped importing sugar from Cuba, as the United States made up about 80% of its sugar exports. President John F. Kennedy believed a resolution to the problems with Castro might lie with a CIA-backed armed invasion of the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's mainland. On April 17, 1961, President Kennedy issued final approval for the mission. However, the plan ended in failure on April 19th as over 100 men were killed and 1,100 captured. One of President Kennedy's responses to the Bay of Pigs fiasco was to cut Cuba off economically through a trade embargo. Though it did not topple the communist regime, the feeling of distrust Americans had in regard for Cuba led to higher surveillance. Eventually, this brought about the discovery of nuclear missile sites on the island. October 14, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis commenced. An American U-2 reconnaissance plane flew over San Cristobal taking pictures. After meticulous study of the photos, it was decided that Soviet missiles had been placed in Cuba, a mere 90 miles from the United States. October 16th, Day 1. A meeting took place in the Oval Office consisting of top advisors to Kennedy, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, and others who were on a need-to-know basis. The group was known as EXCOM, short for Executive Committee of the National Security Council. 3 possible actions were discussed. Let the Soviets keep their missiles to undoubtedly avoid a direct conflict, bomb the missile sites and most assuredly provoke an armed engagement, or utilize a blockade in hopes of creating a peaceful response to the crisis. Day 2. The concept of an airstrike was further explored. However, if the United States failed to remove every missile base, then the gravest issues may arise. More photos were analyzed and the situation escalated. Several informal, divisive discussions were conducted without Kennedy's presence in the Executive Committee. Day 3. President Kennedy met with Andrei Gromyko, the Foreign Minister of Russia. They spoke of the Russian-Cuban alliance, and Kennedy made it known that if the United States found any offensive weapons in Cuba, there would be armed repercussions. He gave no word on what the United States knew about the missile sites, since the plan was not yet established. Day 4. EXCOM decided the blockade could be backed up legally. Not wanting to give the impression that America was waging war, the president used semantics and changed the name from blockade to quarantine. This plan had dangerous implications if the Russians decided to not yield to the American Navy, but it seemed more likely to elicit a peaceful solution. Day 5. The president decided that he was going to be sick so that he could reach a settlement amongst the EXCOM members. Kennedy was shown the draft for his Monday night speech on the crisis and it was edited. The chief of naval operations was given the command to prepare for the blockade, and troops were sent to Florida to prepare for war. Day 6. Kennedy's speech was printed, and several copies were sent to American allies. Khrushchev received a copy, and included was a personal letter explaining the actions Kennedy was putting into place. Later, General Walter Sweeney of the Tactical Air Command informed President Kennedy that studies showed an airstrike would not 100% guarantee all the sites would be destroyed, and this approach was discarded. Day 7. President Kennedy stressed grew for the speech he must deliver later that evening. The time came for the president to address the nation. He began with a summary of the situation in Cuba. Kennedy made sure to let all know that Russia was to blame and not the island nation. He spoke of the quarantine and called upon Premier Khrushchev to remove the missiles. Day 8. The Soviets responded to the speech Kennedy delivered the previous night. It was a long, accusation-filled letter written by Khrushchev claiming the actions of the United States were meant to start a nuclear war. Later that day, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization voted unanimously that America would be justified by using force. Day 9. At 10 a.m., the quarantine on Cuba began. The Soviets did not expect such an assertive response from America, making them uncertain of what to do. Khrushchev proposed a meeting to negotiate, but the EXCOM room did not want to give up control of the situation. In order to prevent this regression, Kennedy explored his options for dealing with the missile bases, and the United States military went into DEFCON 2. U-2 planes were sent out, and more photos were taken, revealing that the sites were still being worked on. Day 10. Kennedy wrote to Khrushchev about the operational missiles, urging that the weapons be dismantled, and that the Soviet involvement in Cuba would come to a halt. However, the quarantine was effective as Soviet ships began to change their course. Day 11. The first Soviet ship was checked and nothing was found, so it moved on to Cuba. More photos of the sites showed that they were still in the construction process and that the work was being done rapidly. Preparing for the worst, anti-aircraft missiles were placed in Key West and Guantanamo Bay was fortified. Negotiations did not advance, so the United States considered forcibly removing the missiles through bombings or attack. Kennedy made it known that Soviet ships must not be handled with aggression, and the quarantine continued. Later that night, Khrushchev sent a letter stating that Russia would withdraw its weapons and the men from Cuba under two conditions. 1. In exchange for the promise that no country, including the United States, would invade Cuba, and 2. If the quarantine was lifted. Day 12. Another letter was received that set one more condition. Khrushchev wanted American missiles in Turkey removed. This proposal had already been denied in earlier planning by XCOM. The missile sites in Turkey had no military value, but were very symbolic of American power. If missiles from Turkey were removed, it would reflect poorly on the United States. Their safety would appear to be of a higher priority than that of Europe, potentially unsettling the Western alliance. The United States decided not to respond to any of the deals until the missile construction halted. Later that day, one of the American U-2 planes went missing, and it became clear it had been shot down. Castro later broadcast defiance towards the American surveillance and warned that any intruders would be shot. After this event, the XCOM members resolved to give Khrushchev more time to ensure that Castro was, in fact, under control. An American response to Khrushchev's two letters was sent. Kennedy and his consultants were willing to meet the Russian demands besides that of exchanging the Jupiter missiles for those of Cuba. While the committee was fairly certain that the event would not turn nuclear, and because the United States' nuclear weapons were of a higher caliber, they could not, with good conscience, say anybody would win in that situation. Day 13. The crisis concluded. An arrangement had been reached. Khrushchev trusted that America and countries of the Western Hemisphere would not attack Cuba, and the United States' naval quarantine would be removed. Kennedy also made a secret exchange to remove the Jupiter missiles if Khrushchev would keep the transaction private. There was much to be learned from the events that transpired over these trying 2 weeks. As a result of the confrontation, Castro became even more resentful of the Americans while retaining his control over the island nation. The embargo that the United States placed on Cuba was not going to be removed very quickly, so long as the communist regime held power and mistreated its people. Also, the United States could no longer continue its attempts to forcibly remove the Cuban leader because of the solution to the crisis. This resulted in a halt in Cuba's economy and their technology. Khrushchev was left in the shadow of the United States and declined in his power due to loss in image. In conclusion, regardless of whether America did or did not give ground during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the impacts have been felt for the half-century following. Even though the United States' Jupiter missiles located in Turkey were outdated, giving into the bargain resulted in a loss of national security. However, since the Russians and the United States both removed their missiles, a state of equilibrium was reached. The driving force that kept either side from targeting enemy countries was the idea of mutually assured destruction. Coming that close to losing millions of lives in a nuclear exchange has taught us to approach events using all diplomatic means available. During this time, both countries had the nuclear arsenal to bring an end to civilization multiple times, which is still the case today.
It is insane that two men sitting on opposite sides of the world should be able to decide to bring an end to civilization. John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Continuing factors still drive policy, such as the idea that the United States does not negotiate with terrorists. Instead, the United States compromises when innocent lives hang in the balance. President Obama has been working to improve relations with Cuba since December 2014. The two countries have restored diplomatic ties, and U.S. and Cuban embassies have reopened in Havana and in Washington. In addition, President Obama is planning an official visit to Cuba. From 1959 to today, the relationship between the United States and Cuba has been tense. However, the two nations are attempting to break down the barriers that have separated them for so long, a reality that was inconceivable throughout the threat of mutually assured destruction in the Cold War.
Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved. Thank you and good night.